Thanks so much, everybody, for coming out to our second session of Socialist Night School for our 2021 semester. My name is Lily. Like I said, Robert and I are going to be your facilitators tonight. So we're going to get to breakout discussions towards the end, and you're going to get to meet some of our other comrades who participate in the Socialist Night School Committee. And if you'd like to get involved or you just want to be added to our chapter's mailing list, you can use the form. We're going to go ahead and drop the link in the chat for you now. So before jumping into our presentation, I just want to go over a few things to make sure that everyone here tonight has a safe and pleasant experience. So we're going to be recording the session, but rest assured, no one's image, voice, or identity is going to appear on the recording except for mine and Robert's. So you're welcome to type any questions or comments that you might have into the chat during the presentation. And like I said, at the end, we are going to jump into some breakout groups, and then afterwards, we're going to come back as a larger group to quickly debrief. So with that said, just be respectful of other people's pronouns. If you're unsure of someone's pronouns, we advise that you go ahead and just default to using they, and just be mindful of the time and space that you're taking up so that others can have the chance to participate in your group discussion. Last thing, we really hope that everyone here tonight is here in good faith, but if not, we will not hesitate to kick people out who are disruptive or disrespectful of the other participants. And with that said, I'm going to go ahead and pass it back to Robert.
All right, so tonight's session is going to look more or less like this. We're going to talk about some of the old origins of coal in Appalachia, particularly in West Virginia. We're going to look at the rise of socialism and labor unions in Appalachia. We're going to look at how labor unions became militant and fought back as against the reaction that inevitably came in the 20th century. And then, as Lily said, we're gonna end things with a little breakout discussion at the end, which we hope all or most of you will be able to stick around for. That's gonna be about 10 to 15 minutes at the end. So in this first session, I'm going to talk a little bit about the origins of coal mining in Virginia, as well as what is now West Virginia. So just to give a little bit of a background, the first time that coal was recorded in West Virginia goes all the way back to 1742. There was a German explorer, a guy named John Peter Sailing, who set off from Natural Bridge in Virginia, which is down here near Lynchburg and Roanoke. And they sailed up the New River, which you can see highlighted on the map, into what is now West Virginia. And when they got to what is now the area of Charleston, which is the current capital, this is called it turns into the Kanawha River. And that's the name of this county where Charleston is. It's called Kanawha County. And there's a little tributary here called the Coal River. And here is where this German guy sailing and his crew first reported coming across some outcroppings of coal. And that's obviously how the river got its name. Funny enough, they didn't really have enough time to explore it more in depth because shortly after that, they were taken captive by some river pirates and taken down to New Orleans. But this account is the earliest known description of coal in what is now the United States. And although coal was known to occur all throughout West Virginia, no extensive mining took place until the mid-1800s, so almost a century after it was first discovered, because there really wasn't an incentive to exploit coal. There was plenty of wood, and there wasn't really the heavy industry necessary anyways. So while there might be, individual homesteads and people who would use coal to heat their homes, there wasn't really any large-scale coal mining. Until the mid-1800s. This is when the first coal companies started to form under the Virginia laws, particularly laws that encouraged financial investments from out of state and from other countries. And this was primarily in the northern parts of the state. Of course, back then, Virginia and West Virginia were one state. And so the coal mines were really concentrated up here in the north, as well as in Pennsylvania and in Ohio. The southern coal fields in West Virginia really were not opened until the 1870s, even though they were known to exist for a lot longer than that. And part of what made this possible was the expansion of the railway. The most prominent rail company in Appalachia was the Chesapeake and Ohio Railway, which some of you may be familiar with. It was founded in 1869 in Richmond for the purposes of connecting the Ohio River Valley, so northern West Virginia and Ohio, with the Chesapeake and the ports in Virginia. And even though it no longer exists, you've probably seen this logo. If you live here in Charlottesville, the C&O restaurant downtown, it's called that because that building used to be the home of the regional offices for the company. And the next time you drive under a rail bridge, there's a good chance that you might see this logo, the C&O logo. So as early as the 1850s, there were tons of immigrants coming into West Virginia from Wales, from Scotland, from England. There were also immigrants from Poland, Hungary, Italy, Greece. And this all contributed to the the ethnic diversity that you still see in some parts of West Virginia today. Some of you may be aware, but others maybe not, that the unofficial dish of West Virginia is the pepperoni roll. Which I presume came from Italian immigrants. But as the coal industry started to grow in West Virginia, like I said, most of this was really from out-of-state capital, and thus was run by out-of-state owners. So very little of this wealth, as we all know very well, stayed in West Virginia. And there was a high demand for cheap foreign labor, especially from Southern Europe. And so these workers were abused with long working hours, poor medical conditions, and just inferior living conditions. The conditions were so bad that finally in 1883, West Virginia passed the first coal mining legislation where they appointed a mine inspector to inspect all the mines for adequate safety conditions. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Lily, who's going to talk about socialism in West Virginia.
Okay. So this slide is to give some broader context on the status of the Socialist Party, which was surprisingly powerful force during the early 1900s. The US Socialist Party had about 150,000 dues-paying members before World War I. So compare that to approximately the 100,000 that DSA has today. So Eugene Debs, the leader of the Socialist Party, won over 1 million votes for presidency in 1912. The party elected over 2,000 candidates to public office and published hundreds of newspapers and journals. The Socialist Party's greatest period of growth coincided with the progressive movement of the early 1900s. So unfortunately, until the 1990s, there were really few scholarly attempts at documenting the history of socialism and radical unions in the United States. So none of this is common knowledge. A lot of the scholarship of today's session comes from the book Working Class Radicals by Frederick Barkey, who's a labor historian at Marshall University in West Virginia. So the first significant growth of the Socialist Party in West Virginia coincided with this period of rapid industrial growth of the 1890s and early 1900s. So an increased need for workers brought together groups of native-born and immigrant workers, as well as significant number of Black workers. An expansion of the railway, it sped up exploitation of the state's natural resources like coal, oil, lumber, and glass production. So from about 1890 to 1900, the population of West Virginia increased by 25%. So for some immigrants, adherence to socialism was seen as an attempt to retain a cultural identity, or as a defense mechanism against rejecting the dominant society. Immigrants in the Socialist Party were primarily of German descent, but also Italians, Finns, Poles, and Belgians who came to work in glassworking. So at this time, the coal fields were largely unorganized as unions didn't have federal protections. And Wheeling was the center of socialist organizing in West Virginia, as it was the oldest and most industrialized city in the state. It was also the capital until about 1885. So in 1900, the Eugene V. Debs chapter of the Socialist Party was launched in Wheeling. And then by 1910, local socialists had begun to elect candidates to office. In 1912, more than 15,000 West Virginians voted for Debs for president. And then by 1914, several thousand West Virginians were dues-paying members of their local branch. So Eugene Debs, as we had mentioned, and Irish-born Mary Mother Jones were foundational figures who played a big role in introducing socialism to West Virginia. The Socialist Party sent both of them to speak to workers across the state. And in 1912, Debs addressed a crowd of 5,000 workers in downtown Wheeling, where he explained the need for unions, as well as a full-blown call for socialism and worker control. So in this photo, you can see Mother Mary Jones rallying workers in Montgomery, West Virginia. This was taken in August 1912. So into this tumultuous period, we see an emergence of the first unions in Appalachia. So the United Mine Workers of America, they began organizing around Wheeling as early as 1890 to push for better conditions. In 1897, there was a strike in Pennsylvania, and it ended in the massacre of 19 immigrant workers, which promoted a more proactive urgency from the United Mine Workers. Shortly after, in 1905, West Virginia established the Department of Mines to enforce inspection laws. But it wasn't until the New Deal era that the federal government stepped in to help miners. The National Industrial Recovery Act passed to help industry and labor during the Depression, and that's what established the 8-hour workday, minimum wage, and condoned unions. Although the act was later declared unconstitutional, most of the industries had unionized by then. And then after the 1930s, the union became a more powerful force in guaranteeing welfare, retirement, and many other benefits for miners.
Sorry, one of the first major coal fields in the southern part of West Virginia was this one called the Flat Top Pocahontas Field, which is located in both Virginia and in West Virginia. And it's named that because it is located over the town of Pocahontas in Virginia, which is close to the border. And so this coal field first opened in 1883 and grew quickly from that time. And it continued to thrive throughout both of the world wars, and the United Mine Workers were able to gain a foothold in this coal field after the 1930s. At this time, African Americans were flooding in from the South in search of better jobs and a better way of life. And to this day, McDowell County, which is one of the counties that's covered by the coal field, still has the highest percentage of African American population of any West Virginia county. By 1917, 1 in 3 mine workers working in the Pocahontas field was Black, the majority of whom were given the hardest and worst paying jobs, like digging, loading, and hauling the coals down in the dangerous underground conditions. And so while labor unions throughout the South were plagued with internal controversy over whether they should include Black workers, the UMW was known as one of the leading labor unions that promoted interracial membership. Black miners were generally welcomed into the union and held seats on the executive board, as well as leadership positions in various locals throughout the state. But though in many ways the opportunities given to Black workers in the coal fields were greater than in other parts of the Deep South, there was still, of course, inequality and discrimination that permeated the workforce. And West Virginia had been dominated by the abolitionist Republican Party up through the Civil War, which is, of course, why it split from Virginia. But similar to the other southern states, like Virginia, By the late 1800s, the control of the state government had shifted to the Democrats, who quickly instituted things like school segregation, denying Black people the right to serve on a jury, among many other things. And so while in other parts of the state, segregation beyond education might have been generally lax, in the coal fields, it was much, much stricter. And so when you study people's history, you quickly learn that whenever the left is successful in organizing working people, especially across racial lines, there is inevitably going to be a reactionary backlash from the capitalist class. Between 1890 and 1914, there's a record of 50 violent strikes that occurred within the United States. And in a short 3-year span from 1910 to 1930, 22 of those strikes occurred. As Lily said before, at this time, the rights of workers to unionize was not yet granted or protected under US law. That wouldn't happen until 1933 with the New Deal and the National Industrial Recovery Act. And so this period of the late 1800s through the early up until the 1920s is known by some historians as the age of industrial violence. And that's not just unique to Appalachia or to the US, but is really a phenomenon that you could apply to other coal mining parts of the world, like Northern England and Scotland had, pretty vicious mine, skirmishes between mine workers and the police, and then the mine owners, as well as northern Spain. You see it also in India and Australia. So basically anywhere you have this rapid industrialization coinciding with heavy extractive industries like coal. And so in this section, we're going to look at some of the most notable and violent labor conflicts that occurred in West Virginia and in other surrounding parts of Appalachia. So by no means was this the first, but probably one of the first that captured national attention was the Paint Creek, Cabin Creek strike of 1912. This occurred in Kanawha County, which we talked about earlier, which surrounds Charleston, which is the current capital of West Virginia. And it's considered to be one of the southern coal fields in West Virginia. By this time, the United Mine Workers had been successful, or pretty successful, in organizing most of the northern coal fields, as well as in Pennsylvania, even out west in Colorado. But still, these southern West Virginia coal fields remain largely unorganized and would remain largely so until the 1930s. It's estimated that up to 90% of all coal miners in West Virginia lived in company towns, which if you were here before we started, you saw the video that briefly explained what company towns were like in Appalachia. So this meant that the company owned the workers' homes. It paid workers in this fake money that they called scrip, which could only be used at the company store. And so workers and their family could be evicted at any time at the discretion of the owners. And so in the spring of 1912, the United Mine Workers had managed to win a small pay raise for organized workers in other parts of the state and up in Pennsylvania. Down in Kanawha, only about half of the mines were unionized. And the non-unionized workers were actually receiving higher pay than the unionized workers, which was a deliberate tactic by the owners to sway the workers against the unions. When they found out about this, the organized miners went to the owners, demanded that they honor the pay raise won by the UMW, along with other demands like putting an end to the company script system. Unsurprisingly, the owners still refused. So both the organized and the unorganized miners joined together and went on strike. In response, the owners tried to bring in scabs, which is a classic tactic. They hired a substantial number of private guards who came from the infamous Baldwin Felts detective agency, which maybe some of you have heard of before. They are notorious for basically playing the villain in just about every single labor struggle in the early 1900s. They actually started out as a legitimate detective agency. They were based in Southwest Virginia. They would investigate train robberies and bank heists. But when that market started to decline at the turn of the century, there weren't as many trains being robbed, so they branched out into strike breaking and providing private security for mine owners. And they even expanded out into Colorado to take part in the violent coal wars out there too. You can see in this picture on the left, there's, of course, the C&O logo and a Chesapeake and Ohio railway train. So in the face of this overwhelming show of force from the mine owners, the miners in Kanawha, they retreated into the mountains, into the small towns that were friendly to unions. They constructed tent villages and basically conducted a guerrilla campaign against the private security, the private militia. There were many labor struggles that came before Paint Creek, and many of those were often violent as well, but the level of violence and the level of bloodshed that occurred during the summer of 1912, historians say that it looked more like an actual civil war with, small skirmishes in the mountains and full-scale battles. The UMW, which was based at the time up in Columbus, Ohio, was unable to provide a lot of material support to the miners. So instead, they turned to the local Socialist Party chapter. Mother Jones had just arrived from another strike, and they say that she and her party, they physically fought their way through the private militia lines to join the strikers. She gave a rousing speech to a large group of miners, and then organized a secret march of 3,000 armed miners who went to the steps of the state capitol in Charleston and read a declaration of war to the governor, which is pretty incredible. And there's this great quote at the top from Mother Jones, which she delivered or she said in a speech that she gave to the miners during the strike. I'm not going to read it because I can't do it justice. It just sounds cheesy coming out of my mouth. But it's estimated that over 100 people on both sides were killed. The physical damage totaled over $100 million, which today is the equivalent of $2.7 billion, which is just incredible. And there were many other labor struggles going on at the same time. West Virginia was a powder keg, just waiting for a spark to explode. A couple years after Paint Creek in November of 1919, the United Mine Workers were actually able to win a pretty substantial wage increase of 14%, even though a government study actually recommended that 27% was probably more appropriate to make up for the wartime inflation from World War I. But still, the mine operators refused to collaborate. They refused to honor this raise that the union had won. And so hundreds of people, hundreds of miners started to join the United Mine Workers. And once again, the companies turned to the Baldwin Felts Agency to raise these private militias. And in the town of Mattawan, which is in West Virginia, it's right along the border with Kentucky, the mayor and the police chief, who was a man named Sid Hatfield, he was actually a member of the famous Hatfield family of the Hatfield and McCoy's fame. So he and the mayor, they confronted Albert Felts, who was the owner of the Baldwin Felts Agency, and several of his agents as they were trying to evict the miners and their families from the company towns. And when Hatfield and the mayor attempted to serve an arrest warrant for Felts, he shot the mayor in the stomach and killed him. And this huge gunfight broke out. Dozens of people died. The street battle became known as the Mattawan Massacre, or the Battle of Mattawan. There's actually there's a famous film from the late 80s called Mattawan that depicts these events. This is not actually a photograph. This is actually a still from the movie, if you're interested in checking it out, by the director, John Sayles. The following year, maybe some of you have heard of this. It has a bit more name recognition than Paint Creek or Mattawan, but this was just about a year after the events in Mattawan. So Sid Hatfield, the sheriff of Mattawan, went to court, was brought into court on charges of blowing up some company property during a battle against the mine owners. Which, by the way, I guess this is one of the very few instances where a police officer was actually on the good side of history. But anyways, as he's walking up the courthouse with his wife, along with the mayor and his wife, a group of Baldwin Felts agents shot and killed both of the men who were unarmed. And so for the miners, this was kind of the last straw. And so 3 weeks after that, there were thousands of miners that took up arms. Some of them were veterans from World War I who had on their uniforms, but what they all had on were red bandanas as a symbol of solidarity. And this is where the term redneck comes from. So in the span of 5 days in 1921, from August to September of that year, it's estimated that there were 13,000 armed coal miners who were known as the Redneck Army, and they confronted a few thousand police, militia, and strike breakers. Interestingly, a quarter of the Redneck Army were African Americans. There were also a lot of recent immigrants who took part, and it is the largest labor uprising in United States history and the largest armed uprising since the Civil War. It is also the first time that the United States military used aircraft for bombing campaigns on US soil. It is, however, correct to point out that the first instance of planes being used to bomb civilians in the US actually happened just a few months prior to this, during what's known as the Tulsa race riots, where basically white mobs just destroyed and homes and businesses of African Americans in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and killed a bunch of Black people. And they used planes, but the difference is that those were private planes, whereas here in Blair Mountain, this was the chief of the United States Army Air Service, which is the predecessor of the Air Force, was personally there and oversaw this campaign, and used it as a deliberate opportunity to display the usefulness of air power in war. It kind of reminds you of how Hitler and Mussolini used Spain and the Spanish Civil War as their testing ground for World War II. There's a really great Jacobin article, actually, that was written by the founder of the West Virginia Mine Wars Museum. If you want to read more about these events, or just need a good place for some further research, I'm going to post that on the website when we upload this recording. And finally, there is, oh, sorry, this is Lily's part.
And finally, Bloody Harlan. So on a personal note, my grandmother is actually born in Harlan County. Her father was a coal miner. All of her brothers were coal miners. She was born in the 1930s, so right around the time of the Harlan County War, also known as Bloody Harlan. So it was a series of violent strikes and skirmishes that took place in Harlan County, Kentucky in the 1930s. And it's a pretty straightforward dispute. The mine workers wanted to organize for better working conditions, and the owners retaliated by firing workers who joined the UMW and then evicted them from their company-owned homes. In solidarity, most of the remaining workforce also went on strike. The strike breakers were protected by private mine guards and the Kentucky National Guard. So passage of the Wagner Act in 1935 helped the miners tremendously by outlawing company unions, blacklisting, and then discrimination on the basis of union activity. So the classic labor song, Which Side Are You On?, which you may have heard at the beginning in the intro, was written during Bloody Harlan by Florence Reese, a wife of a miner and also a UMW organizer. That scene is from an excellent documentary. It's called Harlan County, USA. I recommend very highly that you spend some time and watch it. And it focuses on similar struggles in Harlan County that were taking place in the 1970s, and then it uses the struggles of the 1930s as context. So as these battles are going on, one thing was clear to the socialists in West Virginia. The masses must be thoroughly organized and indoctrinated. And the Brotherhood of Cooperative Commonwealth, the BCC, was an actual organization established by Eugene Debs. But more broadly, the term cooperative commonwealth is used as an aspirational idea proposed by Debs and other early socialists that would have been common to socialists and radicals in Appalachia. In West Virginia, socialists were able to co-opt the Ohio Valley Trades and Labor Assembly and local labor council of the AFL, which represented most of the unions in the region. Socialist Party members got elected to leadership positions, and rallies and speeches by figures like Deb were great recruiting and propagandizing tools, along with the party paper. Socialists hoped that socialism in America would be achieved through a gradual nationalization of banks and publicly owned utilities. So socialists succeeded in getting the Trades and Labor Assembly to officially declare itself in favor of this. And socialist agitation was aided by the National Party, who sent professional organizers to train and mentor local party members. So workers were encouraged to join local socialist clubs who would hold informal meetings outside of workplaces. Through political education and a conscious creation of working class culture, the West Virginia socialists were able to convince workers of the need for constant political and economic struggles against the capitalists. So where does labor go now? So unionizing in Virginia and West Virginia has never been very high, and outside of the mines has always been concentrated in urban centers of Virginia like Richmond, Petersburg, and Norfolk. The International Longshoresmen's Association has a long presence in the port of Norfolk. For most of Virginia history, the most important crops were cotton and tobacco. The finished products, textiles, clothing, and cigarettes. They were dominating the Commonwealth's industrial sector. These decades also saw a rising number of women in the workplace. A 1920 study highlighted the rapidly growing number of working women. Already, women accounted for about 50% of textile workers. In clothing, that was more like 90%. And in tobacco, it was more than 80%. So although they faced near total segregation in the workplace, Virginia Black workers also made a place for themselves at labor's table. They often showed a far greater interest in organizing than whites, and efforts resulted in an all-black union locals representing workers and a handful of trades such as railroading, shipbuilding, and tobacco processing. These locals were referred to as B units, locals that predominantly organized Black workers, but also worked alongside all white locals in similar trades. So however, despite the best efforts of labor organizers, most of Virginia's working people never joined a union. Although official numbers are tracking, they indicate at the height of organizing around the 1930s, union members accounted for less than 15% of Virginia's workforce. And today we know that that's much lower. Anti-union views had a long history in the South, and many Virginians resisted unionization out of suspicion, fear, perhaps pride, but a lot of people were just simply indifferent. So of those who did join locals, many did so for less ideological reasons, more like banquets, summer excursions, and the annual Labor Day celebrations. They were often more attended than union meetings or general strikes.
Thank you, Lily. So during both of the world wars, there was a very high degree of collaboration between labor and industry. Um, labor didn't want to be seen as unpatriotic, but after the war, there was this great series of strikes that swept across the country that was known as the Great Strike Wave of 1946, which convinced conservative businessmen and politicians that organized labor had come out of the war as both communist influence and too powerful. So with the Red Scare and McCarthyism underway, Americans were becoming wary of labor disputes, especially violent labor disputes. And plus, Virginia at the time, I guess you could say still today, was tightly controlled by a conservative democratic oligarchy. And so, radicals and socialists, had a real uphill battle fighting against or, upending the status quo. And so, these labor actions that were attempted by the unions really just only bolstered, the anti-union campaigns that were already well underway, as I said, with the Red Scare, after the post-war period. Just as an example, there was a strike by workers of the Chesapeake Ferry Company. And so in response, the state just seized the company, fired all the workers, and then proceeded to operate it as a public service. Another notable incident, or another notable event occurred in the spring of 1947. The International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, or the IBEW, announced that its members would strike against the Virginia Electric and Power Company, known as VEPCO, unless its demands for a wage increase were met. And by the way, VEPCO is the direct is the direct descendant of Dominion Energy. The governor at the time was a man named William Tuck. He was a Dixiecrat. He was part of the infamous Byrd organization, which is a political machine led by the former governor and senator Harry Byrd, which dominated Virginia politics from the 1890s all the way until the late 1960s. So for 70 plus years, these Dixiecrats and this organization just had a stranglehold on politics in Virginia and were vehemently anti-union and anti-worker. And so the governor said to the union, asking them to promise that they would not let the power go out and would not continue to strike beyond the agreed upon standoff date. The union refused. And so in response, the governor did something very remarkable and unprecedented. There is actually a special power that is granted to the governor of Virginia. It had never been used before and has never been used since. But basically what this statute does is it divides the militia into different classes. There's the National Guard, which most people are aware of. There's a naval militia, among other things, but there's also, and I don't know if this is unique to Virginia, I know most states don't have this, but there's what's called a quote unquote unorganized militia in the state constitution. And so 2 days before the strike deadline, the governor actually drafted all of the VEPCO employees into the unorganized militia and ordered them to continue working their jobs to keep the power running. And if any of the workers who were now officially members of the quote unquote unorganized militia were to defy the governor or even quit their job, they risk discipline under military law, which is just incredible when I read this. Yeah, exactly. That shit is crazy. And I'm not aware if this is still on the books. I wouldn't be surprised, but yeah, I never knew. Perhaps the most depressing part of this whole incident is that apparently it was very popular with the public, who were impressed by this creative, heavy-handed tactic that the governor used. And it's not really surprising because most Virginians were not part of unions and, didn't really support unions. So the IBEW retreated. They settled with the utility. They were never, this was never taken to court, so this was never actually ruled if this was unconstitutional or not, because, everything was settled before. And, just strikes in other parts of the state at some of the coal mines resulted in, things like shortage of fossil fuels and gas. There were rail service strikes, and all of this, in this environment just sort of, turned the public against unions in Virginia. And perhaps more significantly, these events prompted the General Assembly to act quickly on this new innovative legislation that they were working on called Right to Work, which some of you may have heard of. Virginia was actually among the first states to pass a right to work law. It was passed just a few months after the VEPCO strike, so in 1947. Basically, what right to work laws do is they make closed shops and union shops illegal. So a closed shop is a company where the employers are only allowed to hire union members. A union shop is where you can hire non-union workers, but they must join the union after a certain period of time, after they're hired. Right to work makes these illegal. Ironically, right to work was actually originally a socialist slogan that was coined by the French socialist Louis Blanc in 1848. And so this was deliberate phrasing. It was deliberate co-optation in an attempt to reflect what they hope to portray as a fight between quote unquote traditional American individualism and this growing power of organized labor, especially in the South, where any union organizing was seen as a threat to the conservative political machines. And so this was their way at getting back at and severely curtailing the power of organized labor, if not eliminating it. And so when this was signed into law, there was only one single senator in Virginia who spoke against it, and that was the senator from Norfolk. That same year at the national level, the Taft-Hartley Act also banned closed-in union shops at the national level. It called them unfair labor practices. It prohibited unions from engaging in secondary boycotts. So unions couldn't go on strike to support workers at another company. That was now illegal. And this was explicitly segregationist. This is on the record from not just lawmakers in Virginia, but in other states in the South. They explicitly stated that they wanted to pass right to work because they didn't think that Black and white workers should belong to the same unions. In addition, there were a lot of communists who were active in unions at the time, especially in the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations. Many of the communists and radicals, anarchists were purged. If you were to stay in a union, you were forced to sign an affidavit declaring that you were not a communist. And in fact, in Richmond, their local, the Food, Tobacco, and Agricultural Union was dissolved when its leaders refused to sign the affidavits. So just a really horrible time period overall, very hostile to unions. And much of this is only just now, do we have an opportunity to start rolling, these things back, like, with the PRO Act or, other pieces of legislation. And right now, Lily's gonna close us out with the state of unions today.
Yeah, so the state of unions today. So Virginia ranks 45 out of 50 in union representation, with only 4.4 of workers being union members, which is well below the national average. And West Virginia has a relatively higher rate of unionization, around 10.7, which is almost exactly the national average, but that's down from 14% in 2010. So to put this in perspective, Hawaii, which is ranked number 1, is at 24%, New York around 22%, and Denmark, Sweden, and Finland all rank with over 60%, and Iceland with over 90%. So West Virginia only just passed its right to work law in 2016, but there are definitely signs of hope. As we saw the massive teachers strikes from a few years ago that spread across the country, I think it shows that there's a desire for union solidarity and it's still alive. So thank y'all for hanging in there through our presentation. Now we're going to break into small groups for a discussion. We'll meet back here at 9:05. And if Emily and Kevin can just turn on their cameras and give a wave, they're going to be our other facilitators in small group, along with Robert and myself. So real quick, the questions that we're going to go over, we have a bunch, but again, these are just kind of like as guidelines to help guide your discussion. You surely don't have to answer all of them in the short amount of time that we have. But just thinking about how can we define working class today? What are some obstacles, as well as how can we as socialists win back a working class majority? And then what is your experience with unions? Has anybody in your family ever been in a union? And then how could your work experience today be different if you had a union? Do unions still have revolutionary potential? And then what have we discussed that seems like an important piece of history as we make arguments today? All right, comrades, so we're going to go into breakout groups. We'll see you back here in a few minutes to wrap up our session.